you can always solve quadratics by factoring, but sometimes you can't always find a pair of numbers that multiply and add to what you need. And so if the quadratic, or if factoring doesn't work, you have to solve with the quadratic formula. However, I think once you guys learn the quadratic formula, it looks intimidating, but it's not really. But once we solve with the quadratic formula, I think you'll tend to like it just as well, if not better, than factoring in order to solve. Sometimes factoring is faster if it's small numbers and you know your factor pairs, but the quadratic formula always gives you your two answers, and it works if the factor pair, like you can get square roots or whole numbers, it just depends. But with the quadratic formula and with factoring, and then in the 4th 9 weeks we will be graphing these, you are going to see an equation. So this is what? Quadratic formula day 1. Alright, the standard form of an equation looks like this. So a quadratic equation is any equation that has an x squared. And they do graph as a parabola, which we will find out here in a week or so when we start graphing. So with a quadratic, the coefficient that is with x squared is what we call a. The coefficient that's with x is what we call b. And then the coefficient, or the constant that is the number without the variable, is always c. And if you can see here, remember whenever we factored, it had to be equal to 0 before we could factor it? The quadratic formula is the exact same way. The formula does not work until everything is equal to 0. So we'll start with some that are equal to 0 today, and then we'll talk about, like, what about if it equals 5, and we'll move some things over. But the quadratic formula looks a little messy, but I promise there is math behind it. It's not just a magical equation. It really does mean something. So whenever we plug these in, we will plug in our numbers for A, B, and C. And if you can see B, you see a B twice. So the equation to find these is negative B, or I always like to say the opposite of B, and then that plus or minus symbol that we talked about on Friday. One time you add the numerator, one time you subtract the numerator to get your two answers. And then inside the square root, we are going to type in, or plug in b squared, and then minus 4ac, 4 times a times c, and then our denominator is always 2 times a. And so you will be given equations, we'll identify what a, b, and c is, and then we'll plug those in and simplify them like we did on Friday. And we will, most of the time, we get two answers. And I'll say tomorrow we'll talk about what happens if we don't get two answers. Sometimes you just have one, and that's okay too. So we are going to do some examples, and I'm going to adjust my camera just a little bit. There we go. All right, here's our first example of the day. All right, we've got x squared plus 11x plus 30 equals 0. So we always want to identify the a, b, and c values, which are the coefficients. So if a is always the coefficient of x squared, what's our a value here? What's the coefficient with x squared? If it's not there, it's a 1. All right, now our b value is the coefficient with x, and it's a positive 11. C is our constant without the variable, and so that is 30. All right, so at this point, once we know our values, we just plug them in to the formula where we see them. And our whole point is we are solving for x, so we always want to start out with x equals. All right, so the formula says the opposite or negative b. So we have a negative sign, but what do we plug in for b? 11 plus or minus, and then inside the square root, we've got some work to do. All right, the first thing is b squared. So anytime you're plugging something in, I would recommend putting parentheses around it, especially when we start having negatives. It helps you organize a little bit. So we have b squared. Now the minus 4 is part of the formula, but now we have to plug in an a and a c. What is my a value? All right, so I'm going to plug in a 1 right here for a. My c value is 30, so that's going to go in right here. And then the whole entire thing is 2 times a, and we know a is 1, so we have 2 times 1. So once we know our a, b, and c values, we can simply plug those in. And now we're going to simplify. So you guys have your calculators, and we are going to simplify here. All right, so negative 11 is just negative 11. We've got our plus or minus. Now, inside the square root, we've got to simplify that first. So you guys tell me, what is 11 squared? 121. Now, what is negative 4 times 1 times 30? Let's do that all in one step. Negative 120. So negative 4 times 1 is negative 4 times 30 is negative 120. So that's a minus. All over 2 times 1 is just 2. Now, this looks like what we did on Friday, right? So we simplify what's inside the square root first. So what happens when you subtract 121 minus 120? All right, so 121 minus 20 is just 1. So we're taking the square root of 1. Do we know that? What is the square root of 1? 1. So we simplify inside the square root, which is just 1, but we have to take the square root of that number. The square root of 1 is 1. Now at this point, we now are able to find our two answers, once by adding the numerator and once by subtracting. So let's add the numerator first. What is negative 11 plus 1? Negative 10 divided by 2 gives me my first solution of negative 5. Now we've got to subtract the numerator. Negative 11 minus 1. What is negative 11 minus 1? Negative 12 divided by 2 gives me a solution of negative 6. So once it's complete, and I will say today, you will be able to, all of your square roots today should be perfect squares, so then we'll be able to add and subtract to get our two solutions. Sometimes you get whole numbers, sometimes you get fractions. Reduce those if you can. But what do you guys think? Not too bad? Honestly, I think the most difficult part is just plugging in the numbers. Then once it's plugged in, it's pretty easy to simplify. So I am going to put a couple equations on the board. Oh, I've got to get a little bit taller. How do I want to do this? All right, now I look a little bit taller. I'm going to break all of my stuff before today's over. And I'll do my best to not throw away these Post-its this week, just so you guys have a reference to these. Alright, 3x squared plus 13x minus 10 equals 0. So I did throw in a negative on this one. Alright, so which value am I going to plug in for A? Alright, my A value is 3. What am I going to plug in for B? 13. And what am I going to plug in for C? If it's a minus, it is a negative. So our C value is negative 10. All right, so I'm just going to rewrite the formula because it's no longer in view of the camera. I will tell you for the quiz, I will have the formula written on the board. It's not something you have to memorize, but I promise doing it over and over and over again, you'll probably memorize it. All right, so our first thing we're plugging in, B is 13. So anywhere I plug in, I put parentheses around it. All right. Squared, B is 13, so 13 squared minus 4. My A value is 3, my C value is negative 10. And I'm dividing by 2 times what? What am I plugging in here? A 3. Alright, so at this point, if you guys want calculators to help you simplify, that's great. So when I plug this in, negative 13 is just negative 13 plus or minus. Now inside the square root, let's simplify a little bit. What is 13 squared? 169. Now what about negative 4 times 3 times negative 10? What happens when you have 2 negatives? It is a positive. Now what is 4 times 3 times 10? 120. And we're going to divide by 2 times 3, which is 6. All right, so we do need to simplify our square root, so let's add the inside. What is 169 plus 120? 289. You guys know that's a perfect square. What number do you think, what number squared gives us 289? It is 17. So the square root of 89 is 17. And then at this point, we can add our numerator to get our first answer, subtract to get the second one. So let's see, if I add, what's negative 13 plus 17? I'm going to say a positive 4 over 6. Can I reduce 4 6? Two-thirds. No decimals, leave them as fractions, but reduce those if you can. Now the second answer when I subtract, what's negative 13 minus 17? Negative 30 divided by 6, negative 5.
All right, do you guys have any questions on those first two? All right, I'm going to give you guys one to try. We will go over it.
Minus 3x minus 2.
And actually, I'm going to help you plug this one into the formula, then I'll let you simplify it on your own.
All right, so what value am I going to plug in for A? 9. What am I going to plug in for B? Negative 3. And C, negative 2. All right, so for my formula, the first thing is negative B. But what? B is negative 3. So make sure you plug in a negative 3. Then inside the square root, the first part is B squared. So I'm going to plug in my negative 3 for B there. Then I have minus 4 times A is 9 times 2 is, or negative 2 is C. And then I'm going to divide by 2 times 9 because it's 2 times A. Now I want you to try to simplify that on your own. And what happens anytime there's two negatives?
What's it turn into? All right, two negatives always turns into a positive.
but I want to make sure that you simplified all of this correctly. Does everyone see why this becomes a positive 3? You'll say, if I have, the formula says negative, but I plug in a negative, 2 negatives do turn into a positive 3. And anything squared is always a positive. So when I square 2 negatives, a negative times a negative is always a positive. So negative 3 squared is a positive 9. And then negative 4 times 9 times negative 2 is a positive 72. And then the denominator is 18. Are there any questions on that part? All right, now the next part we do have to add what's inside. What's 9 plus 72? 81, and do we know the square root of that? 9. All right, so we are going to get our 2 answers now. The first thing I'm going to do is take 3 plus 9 and divide that by 18, which 12 over 18 can be reduced. I can reduce those by 6. So what does that reduce to? 2/3. All right, now when I subtract, I take 3 minus 9 divided by 18, which is negative 6 over 18. I can reduce this by 6 as well. What does that reduce to? Negative 1 and 3. Negative 1/3. So if you can see, sometimes you do get 2 whole numbers. Sometimes you might get a whole number and a fraction. Sometimes you get 2 fractions. That's totally okay. Now, everything up to this point, I have set it equal to 0. Now, if you guys look at those last 2 examples that I have written on the board, they are not equal to 0. But just like we did with factoring, if we see something that needs to be moved, we just do the opposite. So, what is the part that we don't like on example D? Say,
Equals 3.
all right, it equals 3. So we want that side to be equal to 0. So if I want to move that 3 to the other side, am I going to add it or subtract it? All right, we are going to subtract it, and it is a constant. So where am I going to subtract it from? 13. So now that equals 0. That was the whole point. So we are going to do the formula with x squared plus 7x. Now what's 13 minus 3? 10. So you are going to do the quadratic formula, and I'm going to let you guys try this one by yourself. A is 1, B is 7, and now that you've set it equal to 0, your constant or your C value is 10. So plug in what you know. guys think of my work so far? So I have negative 7 plus or minus. And then inside my square root, I have 49 minus 40. What is 49 minus 40? That's 9. What's the square root of 9? All right, so we should be looking at negative 7 plus or minus 3 over 2. How did you guys do? You're going to say, as I walked around, I saw lots of that. So whenever you add, negative 7 plus 3 gives you a negative 4. Negative 4 divided by 2 is negative 2. And when I subtract negative 7 minus 3, it's negative 10 divided by 2, which gives you negative 5. Okay, any questions on D? All right, now, last but not least, we don't like that equals 8. So do I want to add that 8 or subtract that 8 over? If it's a positive 8, do I want to add it or subtract it? All right, now, is there a constant to subtract the 8 from? So where do we want to put that? After the 6. So we are actually going to do the formula with 5x squared plus 6x minus 8 equals 0. So now we have an A, a B, and a C. Don't forget, when we subtract that 8, that C is now a negative 8. We're on our last example, Kelsey, but I recorded it, so you'll be able to watch it. Is it 7th hour? Yeah.
Okay.
All right, so we're plugging in what we know. I'm not going to give you the entire solution yet. Okay, just look at this. What kind of 6 is that in that formula? Negative. Yeah. But when you have to go add and subtract, you have it as a positive 6. You guys agree with that perfect square? Square root of 196 would be 14. All right, so we're looking at negative 6 plus or minus 14 over 10. So if I add negative 6 plus 14 is 8 over 10. reduce those numbers by? Can I reduce it by 4? No, but I can reduce it by 2. So I should have one answer of 4/5. And then whenever I subtract from my second answer, -6 minus 14 is -20. Now that divides to a whole number. So we have an answer of
Teachers, please
-2.
excuse the interruption. Can I have the following seniors to the office, please? Carlos Aparicio, Faith Boltus, Taylor Cameron Stewart, Malachi Kaufman, Lance Frazee, Nolan Gettinger, and Kaylee Cook. Please come to the office. Thank you.
All right, so you guys have to tell me, how did you do? All right, so you guys do have a few of these to try for your assignment today. And then tomorrow we'll talk about like when our square root ends up being something that's not a perfect square and we have to leave our answers in root, like with the roots in them like we did on Friday. So we will revisit that again tomorrow. But then that is all the new content for the week. So you guys can go ahead and work. If you have questions on it, don't hesitate to ask.